Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Lisa's hands tremble as she stares at Derek across their kitchen table. "You're attracted to men?" Her voice breaks. "Our entire marriage was a lie?" Derek's wedding ring feels like a shackle as he nods. Next door, Brennan waits. The truth is finally out, and everything is about to shatter. Before we begin, if you want to hear uncensored stories, the ones too hot for YouTube, check out my Patreon in the description. Now let's get into it. The moving truck appeared on Maple Street on a Saturday morning in late June, interrupting the quiet suburban rhythm Derek Mitchell had perfected over 8 years of marriage. He was mowing the front lawn, sweating through his t-shirt in the early summer heat when the massive vehicle rumbled to a stop at the house next door. The Hendersons had moved out 3 weeks ago, and the for sale sign had come down almost immediately. Derek had wondered idly what kind of people would buy the place, had assumed another young family like most of their neighborhood. He was not prepared for Brennan Cross. The man who stepped out of the driver's side was nothing like the neighbors Derek had imagined. Tall, easily 6'3", with broad shoulders that filled out a faded t-shirt in ways that made Derek's hands falter on the mower handle. Dark hair, strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and an easy confidence in the way he moved that suggested someone completely comfortable in his own skin. Derek guessed early 40s, maybe a few years older than Derek's own 36. Brennan looked around the street, taking in the neat lawns and family-friendly atmosphere. Then his eyes landed on Derek. Even from across the yard, Derek felt the weight of that gaze, felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest that he immediately tried to ignore. Brennan raised a hand in greeting. Derek returned the gesture automatically, then quickly looked back at his lawnmower, pretending sudden intense interest in the grass pattern. His heart hammered in a way that made no sense. It was just a neighbor, just a guy moving in, nothing to get weird about. But when Derek glanced up again, Brennan was still watching him, and there was something in that steady gaze that made Derek feel exposed in ways he couldn't name. Lisa came out onto the porch then, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Derek's wife was pretty in that wholesome way that had first attracted him in college. Blonde, petite, with a ready smile, and an organized approach to life that Derek had found comforting. She represented everything he was supposed to want, everything he'd convinced himself he did want. "Oh, new neighbors," Lisa said brightly, shielding her eyes against the sun. "Should we go introduce ourselves?" Derek wanted to say no, wanted to finish the lawn, and go inside and not think about the way his pulse had kicked up at the sight of a man he'd never met. But Lisa was already walking across their yard toward the moving truck, and Derek had no choice but to follow. Up close, Brennan was even more overwhelming, the kind of masculine presence that seemed to take up more space than his actual body occupied. He smelled like clean sweat and something woodsy, and when he extended his hand to Lisa first, then to Derek, his grip was firm and warm and lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. "Brennan Cross," he said, his voice a deep rumble that Derek felt in his chest. "Just moving in solo, so I apologize in advance for any noise during the unpacking process." Lisa launched into her usual friendly neighbor routine, asking about where he was from, what he did for work, whether he needed any recommendations for local services. Brennan answered easily. He was a freelance consultant, worked from home mostly, had moved from Chicago for a change of pace. Yes, just him. No wife or kids. Derek stood there trying not to stare at the way Brennan's forearms flexed when he gestured, at the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, at the way his mouth curved when he smiled at something Lisa said, trying not to notice any of it and failing completely. "If you need any help unloading," Derek found himself saying, then immediately regretted it. Brennan's eyes found his again, holding for a beat too long. "I might take you up on that. Got some heavy furniture that would be easier with two." The rest of the weekend, Derek found reasons to be outside, trimming hedges that didn't need trimming, washing a car that was already clean, checking the mailbox multiple times, all while watching Brennan move boxes and furniture with an efficiency that spoke of someone used to doing things alone. Their eyes would meet across the yards, and each time Derek felt that same uncomfortable twist in his gut, that same heat that he absolutely should not be feeling. By Sunday evening, Derek had helped carry in a couch and a bookshelf, had made small talk about sports and weather, and had spent far too much time noticing the way Brennan's jeans hung on his hips and the strength in his hands when he gripped furniture. When Derek went to bed that night, Lisa already asleep beside him, he lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying very hard not to think about any of it. The following week established a pattern. Derek worked from home 3 days a week, his job in IT allowing flexibility that Lisa envied. She left for her office job at the hospital at 7:30 each morning, returning around 6. On the days Derek was home, he became hyper-aware of Brennan's presence next door. The sound of his garage opening, the rumble of his truck starting, the sight of him checking his mail or working in his yard. Derek told himself it was normal to notice your neighbors. Told himself he was just being friendly when he waved each morning. Told himself the skip in his pulse meant nothing at all. Then came the Tuesday afternoon when everything shifted. Derek was taking a break from his computer, stretching his legs with a walk to the mailbox, when Brennan's garage door opened. The man emerged carrying a bag of trash to the curb, wearing nothing but athletic shorts and running shoes. His chest and abs were on full display, his skin gleaming with sweat from what must have been a home workout. Derek froze halfway down his driveway, unable to look away from the sight. Brennan's body was a roadmap of defined muscle, the kind that came from dedicated work, not genetics. Dark hair spread across his pecs, trailing down past his navel and disappearing into the waistband of shorts that rode low enough to show the cut of muscle at his hips. Brennan turned and caught Derek staring. A slow smile spread across his face. Knowing and amused, Derek's face flooded with heat, mortification mixing with something darker and more dangerous. "Sorry, should have put a shirt on," Brennan said, not sounding sorry at all. "Just finished a run and didn't think anyone was around." "No, it's fine," Derek stammered, forcing his eyes anywhere but Brennan's chest. "Your property. You can wear whatever you want." Brennan moved closer, crossing from his driveway to Derek's with easy strides. Up close like this, Derek could see the sheen of sweat on his skin, could smell the clean, masculine scent of exertion, could feel the difference in their sizes. Brennan's height and build, making Derek feel smaller, younger, overwhelmed. "How's the work-from-home life treating you?" Brennan asked, his voice casual, but his eyes were anything but. They tracked over Derek's face, with an intensity that made Derek's breath catch. "Good. Busy. You know?" Derek's words came out choppy, his usual composure fracturing under that steady gaze. "I do know. Gets lonely sometimes, working alone all day. Nice to have neighbors close by." Brennan's hand came up, ostensibly to wipe sweat from his brow, but the movement made his bicep flex in ways that Derek absolutely noticed. "You ever need a break from the screen? Feel free to come over. I make decent coffee." The offer was simple, neighborly even, but something in the way Brennan said it, in the way his eyes held Derek's, made it feel like more. Made it feel like an invitation to something Derek shouldn't even be considering. "Thanks," Derek managed. "I'll keep that in mind." He retreated to his house with as much dignity as he could muster, very aware of Brennan's eyes on his back the entire way. Once inside, Derek went straight to the bathroom and splashed cold water on his face, staring at his reflection and trying to understand what the hell was happening to him. He was married, happily married. He loved Lisa. They had a good life, a nice house, plans for kids in the next year or two. He'd never questioned his sexuality, never felt attracted to men. Sure, he could acknowledge when a guy was good-looking in an objective way, but this was different. This was visceral and consuming and terrifying in its intensity. "It's nothing," Derek told himself firmly. "Just a weird reaction to a new situation. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. Over the next 2 weeks, the awareness only intensified. Brennan seemed to be everywhere, and every encounter left Derek more shaken than the last. There was the morning Brennan jogged past while Derek was getting the newspaper, offering a wave and a smile that made Derek's stomach flip. The afternoon they ended up getting mail at the same time, standing close enough at the mailbox cluster that Derek could feel Brennan's body heat. The evening, Lisa invited Brennan over for dinner, and Derek spent 3 hours hyper-aware of every word, every glance, every accidental brush of hands when passing dishes. Lisa liked Brennan, thought he was charming and polite. She mentioned over breakfast how nice it was to have a responsible single guy as a neighbor, instead of the Hendersons' barking dogs. Derek agreed automatically, while trying not to remember how Brennan's laugh had sounded, how his hands had looked wrapped around a beer bottle, how his eyes had lingered on Derek just a fraction too long when Lisa wasn't looking. The worst part was that Derek started cataloging these moments, started replaying them late at night when he couldn't sleep, started noticing things about Brennan that he had no business noticing, the way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, the intelligence in his eyes when he talked about his work, the kindness in how he'd helped old Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down carry her groceries, the casual competence with which he handled tools when fixing his fence. Derek found himself manufacturing excuses to be outside when he knew Brennan would be, found himself checking the window to see if Brennan's truck was in the driveway, found himself thinking about things he absolutely should not be thinking about. 3 weeks after Brennan moved in, Derek was working in his home office when his computer crashed. Completely, catastrophically crashed in the middle of an important project with a deadline that afternoon. He spent 45 minutes trying every troubleshooting trick he knew before admitting defeat. He needed help, and he needed it fast. The IT support line quoted him a 4-hour wait. His co-worker, who usually helped with tech issues, was on vacation. Derek sat staring at his useless computer, panic building, when he remembered Brennan mentioning he'd done tech consulting before shifting to general business consulting. It was a legitimate reason to knock on Brennan's door. Professional help. Nothing weird about it. Derek found himself at Brennan's front door before he could overthink it, pressing the doorbell and immediately second-guessing the decision. Maybe Brennan was busy. Maybe this was presumptuous. Maybe Derek should just tell his boss the project would be late and deal with the consequences. Then the door opened, and Brennan filled the frame, wearing jeans and a Henley that somehow looked both casual and incredibly good on him. His eyes lit up when he saw Derek, a smile curving his mouth that made Derek's heart stutter. "Hey, neighbor," Brennan said, leaning against the doorframe in a way that made his shoulders look even broader. "What can I do for you?" Derek explained the situation, tripping over his words in his haste. Brennan listened with focus, nodding, then stepped back to gesture Derek inside. "Let me grab my stuff and I'll come take a look." Brennan's house was still sparsely furnished, boxes stacked in corners waiting to be unpacked. But what was set up reflected the man's taste. Simple, masculine, quality over quantity. Derek tried not to notice the large bed visible through the open bedroom door, tried not to wonder what it said about Brennan that he'd prioritized setting that up first. They walked back to Derek's house together, Brennan carrying a laptop bag and asking technical questions about the crash. Derek unlocked the front door, hyper-aware of Brennan's presence behind him, of bringing this man into the space he shared with Lisa. The office was upstairs, a converted bedroom that gave Derek privacy for calls and projects. Brennan settled into Derek's desk chair with easy confidence, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he diagnosed the problem. Derek stood behind him, ostensibly watching what he was doing, but really just trying not to stare at the way Brennan's shoulders moved, at the focused expression on his face, at his hands on Derek's keyboard. "There," Brennan said after about 15 minutes. "Corrupted system file. I'm running a repair now. Should be done in 20 minutes or so." "You're a lifesaver," Derek said, relief flooding through him. "Seriously, thank you. I was panicking." Brennan spun the chair around to face Derek, and suddenly they were very close in the small office. Brennan's knees almost touching Derek's legs, his face tilted up, eyes warm and knowing. "Happy to help. That's what neighbors are for, right?" The words were innocent, but Brennan's gaze dropped briefly to Derek's mouth before rising back to his eyes, and Derek's breath caught at the blatant interest he saw there. "Right," Derek managed, his voice rougher than intended. He should step back, should put distance between them, but his feet wouldn't cooperate. "You know," Brennan said slowly, his voice dropping to something more intimate, "I've been meaning to tell you something." Derek's heart hammered. "What's that?" "I'm gay." Brennan watched Derek's reaction carefully, figured I should mention it, given how much time we've been spending together. Some people get uncomfortable once they know. The revelation shouldn't have hit Derek like a physical blow, but it did. Suddenly, every interaction, every lingering look, every moment of tension made sense in a new and terrifying way. Brennan had been flirting with him, had been watching him with interest that wasn't just friendly, had been waiting to see if Derek would respond. "Oh," Derek said, the word barely a whisper. That's fine. I mean, doesn't matter to me." Brennan's smile was slow and devastating. "Doesn't it?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning Derek didn't want to examine. The computer repair program chimed, breaking the tension, and Brennan turned back to the screen, releasing Derek from that penetrating gaze. "All set," Brennan said, his voice back to normal, professional. "You should be good to go now." Derek thanked him again, walked him to the door, and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on work while his mind raced. Brennan was gay. Brennan had been flirting with him. Brennan had basically asked if Derek was interested, and Derek hadn't answered because he didn't know how to answer, didn't know what the answer even was. That evening over dinner, Lisa asked how his day had been. Derek told her about the computer crash and Brennan's help, leaving out the charged moment in the office. She smiled and said again how lucky they were to have such a nice neighbor, and Derek agreed, while his wedding ring felt heavier than it ever had before. That night, Derek lay awake long after Lisa fell asleep, staring at the ceiling and finally admitting to himself what he'd been denying for weeks. He was attracted to Brennan, intensely, overwhelmingly attracted in a way that went beyond aesthetic appreciation. He wanted things he'd never let himself want before, things that terrified him, even as they pulled at something deep in his chest. He was married. He loved his wife. But he couldn't stop thinking about a man who lived next door, couldn't stop wondering what it would feel like to close the distance the next time Brennan looked at him like that. Couldn't stop imagining scenarios that had no place in a married man's mind. Derek turned onto his side, studying Lisa's sleeping face in the moonlight. She deserved better than a husband whose thoughts were increasingly occupied by someone else. But Derek didn't know how to stop, didn't know how to go back to not knowing this about himself. The next morning, Derek resolved to keep his distance from Brennan. Professional politeness when they encountered each other, but no more lingering conversations, no more finding excuses to be outside when Brennan was around. He would focus on his marriage, on his work, on anything except the magnetic pull of the man next door. The resolution lasted exactly 3 days. On Thursday afternoon, Derek was in the garage organizing tools when Brennan appeared in the driveway, wearing work boots and a tool belt, carrying a length of lumber over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. "Building deck stairs," Brennan explained, setting the lumber down. "Could use a second set of hands if you got time. No pressure if you're busy." Derek should say no, should claim work or chores or literally anything else. But he heard himself saying sure, found himself following Brennan next door, found himself spending the next 2 hours holding boards steady while Brennan measured and cut and assembled. They worked in comfortable rhythm, Brennan giving instructions that Derek followed easily. And if their hands brushed when passing tools, if Brennan stood closer than strictly necessary when showing Derek how to hold something, if their eyes met and held across the growing structure, neither of them mentioned it. When the stairs were complete, they stood back admiring the work. Derek's t-shirt was soaked with sweat, his arms aching pleasantly from the exertion. Brennan looked equally disheveled, sawdust in his hair, a smudge of dirt on his jaw that Derek had to actively resist the urge to wipe away. "Thanks for the help," Brennan said, cracking open 2 beers he'd pulled from a cooler. Couldn't have done it alone. They sat on the new stairs, shoulders almost touching, drinking in comfortable silence. The afternoon sun painted everything gold, and Derek felt something dangerous loosening in his chest, some carefully maintained distance starting to crumble. "Can I ask you something?" Derek heard himself say, the beer giving him courage he wouldn't have sober. "Anything?" Brennan replied, his voice quiet and open. When did you know? About being gay? Brennan was quiet for a moment, considering. Always knew, really. Tried to pretend otherwise for a while. Dated women in college because that's what was expected. But I was miserable, and they deserved better than someone faking it. Finally accepted it at 25, and never looked back. Derek absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. That must have been hard. Hardest thing I ever did, Brennan agreed. But also the best. Living a lie was killing me slowly. Being honest, being myself, that's when I finally started actually living. He turned to look at Derek, and his expression was gentle, understanding. Why do you ask? Derek's throat tightened. He should deflect, should laugh it off, should get up and go home to his wife. But sitting here with Brennan, the man's steady presence somehow making it safe to voice thoughts he'd barely admitted to himself, the truth spilled out. I think I might be attracted to you. The words came out barely above a whisper. And I don't know what to do with that. Brennan didn't look surprised, didn't look shocked, just nodded slowly, like Derek had confirmed something he'd already suspected. Okay, Brennan said simply. What do you want to do with it? I don't know. Derek's hands shook as he set down his beer. I'm married. I love my wife. I've never even thought about men like this before. I don't understand what's happening. Sometimes attraction doesn't make sense, Brennan said quietly. Sometimes we spend so long being what we think we should be that we forget to figure out what we actually are. He shifted slightly closer, his thigh pressing against Derek's, solid and warm. I'm not going to tell you what to do. This is your life, your choices. But I will tell you that I've been attracted to you since the day I moved in, and if you ever want to explore what that means, I'm here. Derek turned to face him, and Brennan was so close Derek could see flecks of gold in his eyes, could feel his breath, could smell his scent mixed with sawdust and sweat. One of them just had to lean in a few inches and they'd be kissing, and Derek wanted that with an intensity that scared him breathless. But he couldn't, not yet. Not without thinking it through, without understanding what it meant, without being sure. I need time, Derek said, his voice breaking. I need to figure this out. Take all the time you need, Brennan replied. I'm not going anywhere. Derek went home that evening and made love to his wife, trying to lose himself in familiar comfort, trying to prove to himself that this was enough, that this was what he wanted. But even as Lisa fell asleep in his arms, satisfied and content, Derek stared at the ceiling and knew he was lying to both of them. The next 2 weeks were torture. Derek oscillated between determination to focus on his marriage and finding himself drawn inexorably to Brennan's presence. They'd see each other in passing and the air would crackle with unspoken things. With possibilities Derek was terrified to explore and unable to stop thinking about. Lisa noticed something was off, asked if he was feeling okay, if work was stressing him out. Derek assured her everything was fine, hating himself for the lie, hating that he was becoming someone who lied to his wife. One afternoon, when Lisa had taken a rare day off for a spa appointment with friends, Derek found himself standing in front of Brennan's door. He'd watched Lisa drive away, had told himself he was just going to work in his office, had somehow ended up here instead, with his heart in his throat and his hands trembling. He knocked before he could lose his nerve. Brennan opened the door wearing sweatpants and nothing else, like he'd just woken from a nap. His hair was mussed, his eyes sleepy, and he looked so good, Derek couldn't breathe. Derek, Brennan said, surprise and warmth in his voice. Come in. Derek stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a quiet click that sounded unbearably loud. They stood in the entryway, facing each other, and Derek could feel the weight of the moment, the choice he was making just by being here. Lisa's out, Derek said, the words coming out rushed. She won't be back for 3 hours. I told myself I was just going to work, but I ended up here, and I don't know what I'm doing, but I can't stop thinking about you, and I don't know what that means, and I'm scared, and I just needed to tell you. Brennan listened to the rambling confession with patient focus, then took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His hand came up to cup Derek's jaw, thumb brushing his cheekbone with devastating gentleness. "Do you want to kiss me?" Brennan asked quietly. Derek's breath shuddered out. "Yes. God, yes." "Then kiss me." It should have been awkward. Derek's first kiss with a man. But it wasn't. It was electric and overwhelming and exactly right. Brennan's mouth was firm and demanding, his stubble rough against Derek's skin, his body solid where Derek's hands clutched at his shoulders for balance. Derek had been kissed hundreds of times, had thought he knew what kissing was, but this was different. This was discovering that everything he'd thought he understood about himself was just the surface of something deeper. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Derek was trembling. Brennan's hand slid to the back of his neck, holding him steady. "We don't have to do anything else," Brennan said, his voice rough. "Just this is enough if that's all you're ready for." But Derek shook his head, something breaking open inside him. "Show me. I want to know. I want to feel everything I've been missing." Brennan's eyes darkened with want, but he didn't move immediately. "Are you sure? Once we cross this line, you can't uncross it." "I'm sure," Derek said, and meant it despite his fear, despite the wedding ring on his finger, despite everything waiting back at the house he shared with Lisa. He needed this, needed to know what it felt like to stop running from what he was starting to understand about himself. Brennan took his hand and led him upstairs to the bedroom Derek had glimpsed that first day. The afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, painting everything in warm amber, and when Brennan turned to face him, Derek saw understanding and patience and hunger in equal measure. "We go at your pace," Brennan said, his hands settling on Derek's hips. "You want to stop at any point? We stop. No judgment, no pressure." Then he was kissing Derek again, slower this time, thorough, teaching Derek the rhythm and the give and take. His hands roamed Derek's back, pulling their bodies flush together so Derek could feel the evidence of Brennan's desire, could feel the size difference between them in ways that made his knees weak. Derek had never been with someone stronger, taller, more masculine than himself. With Lisa, he'd always been the one in control, the one who led. But with Brennan, he wanted to surrender, wanted to be overwhelmed, wanted to find out what it felt like to let someone else take charge completely. As if reading his mind, Brennan backed Derek toward the bed, gentle but inexorable. "Your shirt," he said, his voice dropping to a command that made Derek's pulse spike. Derek pulled his shirt over his head with shaking hands, suddenly self-conscious about his body. He wasn't in bad shape, but he wasn't built like Brennan either. Wasn't gym-sculpted or particularly impressive. But the way Brennan looked at him made Derek feel like he was the most beautiful thing in the world. Made him feel desired in a way that was raw and honest and nothing like the comfortable affection he shared with his wife. "Perfect," Brennan murmured, his hands mapping Derek's bare chest with reverent attention. "You're perfect." Then he was lowering Derek to the bed, following him down, and Derek lost himself in sensation he'd never imagined, in the feeling of being wanted by someone who saw him completely and wasn't disappointed by what they found. Then he was lowering Derek to the bed, following him down, and Derek lost himself in sensation he'd never imagined, in the feeling of being wanted by someone who saw him completely and wasn't disappointed by what they found. Brennan's weight settled over him, not crushing but present, grounding Derek in the reality of what was happening. His mouth found Derek's again, kissing him with a thoroughness that made Derek forget to breathe, forget to think. Forget everything except the taste and feel of this man claiming him piece by piece. When Brennan's lips left his mouth to trail down his throat, Derek's head fell back against the pillow, a sound escaping him that he'd never made before. Want and need and surrender all wrapped into one breathless gasp. Brennan's stubble scraped against the sensitive skin of his neck, his teeth finding the spot where Derek's pulse hammered and applying just enough pressure to make Derek's hips buck involuntarily. "So responsive," Brennan murmured against his skin, his voice gone rough with desire. "I've been imagining this for weeks, imagining what you'd sound like, what you'd feel like. Reality is so much better." His hands mapped Derek's torso with reverent attention, learning the planes of his chest, the dip of his ribs, the soft skin of his stomach. Every touch felt amplified, Derek's nerves singing with sensation he'd never experienced. When Brennan's fingers found his nipple, circling and then pinching lightly, Derek cried out, his back arching off the bed. "Sensitive there," Brennan observed with satisfaction, doing it again just to watch Derek's reaction. Good to know. Derek had never thought of his chest as particularly erogenous, had barely noticed when Lisa touched him there. But under Brennan's focused attention, every nerve ending felt electric, connected directly to the heat building low in his belly. Brennan's mouth replaced his fingers, tongue circling and then teeth grazing, and Derek's hands flew to Brennan's hair, gripping hard, not sure if he was trying to push him away or pull him closer. The sensation was overwhelming, too much and not enough all at once. "Please," Derek gasped, though he wasn't sure what he was begging for. "I've got you," Brennan promised, his hands moving to Derek's belt. "Going to take care of you. Going to show you exactly what you've been missing." He made quick work of Derek's remaining clothes, stripping him bare with efficient movements that spoke of experience and confidence. Derek lay exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never been, his body responding to Brennan's hunger with an eagerness that should have embarrassed him but didn't. Brennan stood at the foot of the bed, his eyes traveling over Derek's naked form with an intensity that made Derek feel worshipped and wanted and claimed all at once. Then he hooked his thumbs in his sweatpants and pushed them down, stepping out of them to reveal a body that made Derek's breath stop entirely. He'd known Brennan was big from the way he carried himself, from the times Derek had seen him shirtless. But nothing had prepared him for this, for the sheer masculine presence of him, for the size that made Derek's pulse spike with equal parts nervousness and desperate want. 12 inches, Brennan said with a small smile, reading Derek's expression. "Give or take. We'll take our time, work you open slow. You'll take it all eventually." The confidence in those words sent a shiver through Derek. The certainty that Derek would accommodate him, would stretch and accept and take everything Brennan had to give. It should have been intimidating. And it was, but it was also incredibly arousing. Brennan returned to the bed with a small bottle in hand, settling between Derek's spread thighs. His hands were gentle as they encouraged Derek's legs wider, exposing him completely. Derek's face flamed with heat, but he didn't close his legs, didn't hide. Something in him wanted this exposure, wanted Brennan to see every part of him. "You're beautiful," Brennan said, his voice sincere and rough. "Every inch of you. I'm gonna make this so good for you." Then, his slicked fingers were pressing against Derek in places no one had ever touched, and Derek's world narrowed to the sensation of being opened, being prepared, being made ready for something he'd never imagined wanting. Brennan worked him with patience and skill, talking him through it with a steady stream of praise and instruction. "Relax for me. Breathe. That's it. Just like that. You're doing so well, taking my fingers so perfectly." Derek had never felt anything like it, the initial discomfort giving way to pressure and stretch that morphed into something else entirely. When Brennan's fingers found a spot inside him that made stars explode behind his eyes, Derek nearly came off the bed, a cry tearing from his throat that was pure shocked pleasure. "There it is," Brennan said with satisfaction, stroking that spot again and again until Derek was trembling, gasping, overwhelmed by sensation he'd never known existed. "This is what you've been missing. This is what it feels like when someone knows how to touch you right." By the time Brennan deemed him ready, Derek was a shaking mess of need, his hands fisting in the sheets, his body aching for more. Brennan positioned himself, the blunt pressure making Derek's breath catch, his heart hammering with anticipation and nervousness. "Look at me," Brennan commanded, and Derek's eyes flew open to meet that intense gaze. "Stay with me. I want to see your face when you take me." The first press was slow, careful, Brennan giving Derek time to adjust to the overwhelming stretch. It burned, the pressure intense beyond anything Derek had imagined, and for a moment he thought it was impossible, thought there was no way. But Brennan kept talking, kept praising, kept working himself deeper with patient persistence. "Breathe through it. You can take it. You were made to take it. doing so well for me. And Derek did. Inch by impossible inch, his body opening to accommodate Brennan's size, accepting what felt like too much, until suddenly Brennan was fully seated, and Derek felt impossibly full, stretched beyond his limits, claimed in the most fundamental way possible. All of it, Brennan breathed, his control clearly fraying. You took all 12 inches. God, you feel incredible. He held still, giving Derek time to adjust, to process the overwhelming fullness. Derek couldn't speak, could barely breathe, every nerve ending firing at once. It was too much and perfect and terrifying and exactly what he'd needed without knowing he needed it. When Brennan began to move, slow, careful thrusts that made Derek see stars, the friction and pressure built into something that transcended anything Derek had experienced before. This wasn't just physical pleasure, though there was plenty of that. This was discovering a part of himself he'd kept locked away, finally understanding what had always felt missing. Brennan increased his pace, reading Derek's responses with the skill of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. His angle was perfect, hitting that spot inside Derek with every thrust, making Derek's voice break on sounds he'd never made before. He was loud, uninhibited, in a way he'd never been with Lisa, his pleasure too intense to contain or hide. "That's it," Brennan encouraged, his own breathing ragged. "Let me hear you. Want to know how good I'm making you feel?" Derek's hands scrabbled at Brennan's shoulders, his back, trying to anchor himself against the overwhelming sensation. Brennan caught his wrists, pinning them above his head with one large hand, changing the angle slightly and making Derek cry out. "Mine," Brennan growled, his thrusts becoming more demanding. "Right now, in this moment, you're completely mine." "Yes," Derek gasped, beyond caring how it sounded, how it contradicted everything about his life. "Yes, yours. Please don't stop." Brennan's free hand wrapped around Derek, and the dual sensation was too much. Derek shattered, his release crashing through him with an intensity that whited out his vision, his body clenching around Brennan in ways that made the other man groan. Brennan followed seconds later, and Derek felt the heat of him, felt the way Brennan's control finally broke, felt claimed and owned and completely transformed by what had just happened. In the aftermath, they lay tangled together, both breathing hard, Derek's body trembling with aftershocks. Brennan's weight was comfortable, grounding, and Derek didn't want him to move, didn't want this moment to end and reality to come crashing back in. But eventually, Brennan did move, carefully withdrawing and rolling to the side, pulling Derek against his chest. His hand stroked Derek's hair with surprising tenderness, and Derek felt tears prick his eyes at the gentleness after the intensity. "You okay?" Brennan asked softly. Derek didn't know how to answer that. Physically, he felt wrung out and sore and completely satisfied. Emotionally, he was a mess of confusion and guilt, and something that felt dangerously like joy. "I don't know," he admitted finally. I didn't know it could be like that." Brennan pressed a kiss to his temple. "Now you know. Now you understand what you are, what you need." The words settled into Derek's chest like stones. What he was, what he needed. His whole life he'd been running from this, convincing himself he was straight, that his lack of enthusiasm for sex with Lisa was just him being not very sexual. But this, what he'd just experienced with Brennan, proved that theory completely wrong. He wasn't not sexual, he just hadn't been with the right gender. "What do I do now?" Derek whispered. "I can't undo this. Can't go back to not knowing." Brennan's arms tightened around him. "No, you can't. But what you do next, that's your choice. I'm not going to pressure you. This can be a one-time thing if that's what you need. Or it can be more. But you need to figure out what you want, who you are, and what that means for your life." Derek closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his wedding ring, thinking about Lisa coming home in less than 2 hours, thinking about the life he'd built that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. "I should go," he said, even though everything in him wanted to stay exactly where he was. "I need to shower, need to think." Brennan let him go without protest, but not before pressing one more kiss to Derek's mouth. "Whatever you decide, I'm here. Next door, waiting. No judgment either way. Derek dressed with shaking hands, his body aching in places he'd never ached before, marked in ways that wouldn't show, but he'd feel for days. Brennan walked him to the door, wearing just his sweatpants, and Derek couldn't help one last look at this man who'd just changed everything. "Thank you," Derek said, the words inadequate for what he was feeling. Brennan smiled, sad and understanding. "Thank you for trusting me." Derek walked back to his house on unsteady legs, slipped in through the garage, and went straight upstairs to shower. Under the hot spray, he examined the changes in his body, the tenderness that proved what had happened, the way he moved differently now. When he was clean and dressed, he went to his office and tried to work, but his mind kept replaying every moment, every sensation, every word. Kept comparing what he'd just experienced to 8 years of marriage, and finding his marriage lacking in ways he'd never let himself acknowledge before. Lisa came home at 6, bubbling over with stories from her day, never noticing that Derek was quieter than usual. They made dinner together, ate while watching a show, went through all the comfortable rhythms of married life, and Derek felt like a fraud the entire time. That night in bed, Lisa reached for him, and Derek made an excuse about being tired. He couldn't. Not after this afternoon, not when his body still carried the memory of Brennan. Lisa accepted his refusal with easy understanding, kissed his cheek, and rolled over to sleep. Derek lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind churning. He couldn't keep living like this, couldn't keep pretending to be someone he wasn't, but he also couldn't imagine blowing up his entire life, hurting Lisa, disappointing everyone who knew him. The next morning he called in sick to work, waited for Lisa to leave, and then found himself at Brennan's door again. When Brennan answered, Derek saw understanding and resignation in his eyes. "It can't happen again," Derek said without preamble. "I'm married. I love my wife. Yesterday was a mistake." Brennan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Do you actually believe that?" "I have to believe that," Derek shot back. "I can't be this person, can't want the things I apparently want." Brennan watched him for a long moment. "You know what the saddest thing is? It's not that you're denying who you are. It's that you think loving men means you can't have loved your wife. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, Derek." The words hit like a physical blow. Derek opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. "I've seen this before," Brennan continued quietly. "People who realize they're gay or bi after they've built straight lives. It's terrifying and it's messy and there's no easy answer. But lying to yourself, forcing yourself to be something you're not, that doesn't work. Trust me. What am I supposed to do?" Derek's voice broke. "Tell Lisa I've been lying to her our entire relationship? Destroy our life because I can't get you out of my head?" "You're supposed to be honest," Brennan said simply. "With her, with yourself. She deserves to know who she's actually married to, and you deserve to live as your authentic self." Derek backed away, shaking his head. "I can't. I'm sorry, I can't." He retreated to his house and spent the day trying to convince himself he could go back to normal, could forget what had happened, could be the husband Lisa deserved. But his body betrayed him, aching in ways that kept reminding him of Brennan's touch. And his mind wouldn't stop replaying every moment, wouldn't stop wanting more. 3 days passed. Derek avoided Brennan completely, staying inside even when he saw Brennan working in his yard. But the awareness was constant, the pull undeniable, the need building until Derek thought he'd go crazy from it. On the 4th day, Lisa announced she had to work late, wouldn't be home until 9. Derek told himself he'd use the time to catch up on work, to focus on being productive. But the moment her car disappeared down the street, he was heading next door. Brennan opened the door, looking unsurprised. "Took you longer than I expected," he said, stepping aside to let Derek in. Derek didn't let himself think, just grabbed Brennan and kissed him desperately, pouring all his confusion and want and fear into it. Brennan kissed back with equal intensity, backing Derek against the wall, his hands already working Derek's clothes off. This time there was less gentleness, more urgency. Brennan took Derek right there against the entryway wall, and Derek was loud and shameless, taking every inch with an ease that proved how perfectly his body remembered, how much it craved this. In the aftermath, sprawled on Brennan's living room floor, Derek started crying. Great heaving sobs he couldn't control. All the emotion he'd been holding back breaking free. Brennan held him through it, didn't try to fix it, just let Derek fall apart and kept him safe while he did. "I can't keep doing this," Derek said when he could finally speak. "Can't keep lying to her, but I can't tell her either. I'm trapped." "You're only trapped if you choose to be," Brennan replied. "Staying in a marriage where you can't be yourself, where you have to hide fundamental parts of who you are. That's not fair to either of you. She'll be devastated." Derek's voice was barely a whisper. "She loves me, wants kids with me. I'll be destroying her life." Brennan's hand cupped Derek's face, forcing eye contact. "You'll be giving her a chance at something real, at finding someone who can love her the way she deserves to be loved, and you'll be giving yourself the same chance." The words settled into Derek like truth he'd been avoiding, but knowing what he should do and being able to do it were very different things. Over the next 2 weeks, Derek and Brennan fell into a pattern. Whenever Lisa was at work or out with friends, Derek would go next door. Sometimes they'd have sex, urgent and intense, Derek's body learning to crave things he'd never wanted before. Sometimes they'd just talk, Brennan sharing his own journey of self-discovery, Derek processing his confusion and fear. And slowly, Derek began to understand what he needed to do, began to accept that he couldn't live a lie anymore, no matter how comfortable that lie had become. One evening after Lisa had gone to bed, Derek sat in the dark living room and made a plan. He'd tell her the truth. Not about Brennan specifically, that would only make it hurt worse, but about himself, about finally understanding his sexuality, about needing to live authentically, even if it meant ending their marriage. The conversation happened on a Saturday morning. Derek asked Lisa to sit down, said he needed to tell her something important, and as her expression shifted from curious to concerned to horrified, Derek explained as gently as he could that he'd realized he was attracted to men, that he'd been denying it his whole life, that he couldn't keep pretending. Lisa's first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then devastating tears that broke Derek's heart. She asked all the questions he'd expected. Had he cheated? Did he ever really love her? Was their entire relationship a lie? Could they work through it somehow? Derek answered as honestly as he could. He had feelings for someone, yes, but that wasn't why he was doing this. He had loved her, still cared deeply about her, but he understood now that what he felt wasn't romantic love the way she deserved. And no, they couldn't work through it, because he couldn't change who he was. The divorce was painful and messy. Lisa moved out within a week, staying with her sister while they figured out the logistics. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip, people taking sides, judging Derek for throwing away a good marriage. His family was disappointed, couldn't understand why he was choosing this path. But through it all, Brennan was there. Not as a boyfriend, they agreed it was too soon for that, but as a friend, a support, someone who understood what Derek was going through because he'd been through it himself. 6 months later, the divorce was final. Derek owned the house outright, having bought out Lisa's share. She'd moved to another state, making a fresh start, and Derek hoped she'd find happiness with someone who could give her what she truly needed. And Derek began learning who he actually was, free from the performance he'd been maintaining his whole life. He came out to his family, weathered their disappointment and confusion, and slowly built new, honest relationships with the ones who could accept him. He and Brennan started dating officially, taking it slow, figuring out what they wanted. Sometimes Derek wondered if it was too soon after the divorce, if he should be alone to process everything, but Brennan felt right in a way nothing else ever had, and Derek was done denying himself what felt right. One evening, almost a year after that first afternoon, Derek and Brennan sat on Brennan's deck watching the sunset. Derek's head rested on Brennan's shoulder, their fingers intertwined, completely comfortable in a way Derek had never experienced before. "Do you regret it?" Brennan asked quietly. "All the pain it took to get here?" Derek thought about it, really considered the question. The divorce had been brutal. The judgment from neighbors and family had hurt. Rebuilding his life from scratch had been exhausting. But for the first time in 37 years, he felt like himself. Felt authentic and whole and free. "Not even a little bit," Derek said. For the first time in my life, I'm actually living instead of just existing. That's worth everything it cost." Brennan kissed the top of his head. "I'm proud of you. I know that doesn't mean much, but I am. What you did took real courage." "It took you," Derek replied. "Took you showing me what I was missing, what was possible. I'd still be lying to myself and Lisa if you hadn't moved in next door." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to purple to dark. Inside Brennan's house, which was slowly becoming their house as Derek moved his things over bit by bit, there was warmth and acceptance and the promise of a future Derek had never let himself imagine. He thought about that afternoon over a year ago, standing in Brennan's entryway, trembling with fear and want, convinced he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Turned out it had been the best decision he'd ever made, even though it had taken him through hell to get to the other side. Sometimes loving yourself meant burning down the life you'd built on a foundation of lies. Meant hurting people you cared about in service of a truth you couldn't deny anymore. Meant choosing the harder path because the easy one was slowly killing you. Derek had made that choice, had taken those 12 inches, not just physically, but metaphorically, stretching to accommodate a truth about himself that changed everything. And while he grieved for the pain he'd caused Lisa, for the innocent simplicity of the life he'd left behind, he couldn't regret finally becoming who he was always meant to be. "Come on," Brennan said, standing and pulling Derek up with him. "Let's go inside. I want to show you something I've been working on." Derek followed him into the house, their hands still linked, and whatever Brennan wanted to show him, Derek knew he was ready for it. Ready for all of it, the good and the hard and everything in between. Because this was real. This was honest. This was a life built on truth instead of performance. On love that didn't require him to hide fundamental parts of himself. And that was worth everything. Later that night, wrapped in Brennan's arms in the bed that had become Derek's safe haven, Derek thought about the boy he'd been. The one who'd pushed down every flicker of attraction to other boys, who'd dated girls because that's what was expected, who'd married a woman he cared for but couldn't truly desire the way she deserved. He wished he could go back and tell that boy it would be okay. That the thing he was so afraid of, the truth he was working so hard to deny, wasn't shameful or wrong. That accepting it would be hard but infinitely better than a lifetime of pretending. But he couldn't go back. Could only move forward, living authentically for the first time, building a life that actually fit instead of one he had to contort himself to occupy. "You're thinking too loud," Brennan murmured against his hair. Derek smiled in the darkness, just grateful. "For you, for this, for finally understanding who I am." Brennan's arms tightened around him. "I'm grateful too, for the day I decided to move to this neighborhood, for having the courage to let you know I was interested, for you having the courage to explore what that meant." They drifted off to sleep like that, tangled together in the easy intimacy of people who'd fought for the right to be exactly where they were. And if Derek's last conscious thought was of that first afternoon, of 12 inches and overwhelming pleasure, and a truth he could no longer deny, well, that seemed fitting. Because that afternoon had cracked him open, had shown him what he'd been denying himself, had given him a glimpse of authentic living that made going back to the performance impossible. The neighborhood had mostly accepted them by now, or at least stopped actively judging. Mrs. Chen from 2 doors down still brought them cookies. The Hendersons, who'd moved back in across the street, were a young gay couple themselves and had become fast friends. Life had found a new normal, one where Derek could hold Brennan's hand on evening walks and kiss him goodbye on the front porch and just be. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of grief for the life he'd left behind, still guilt about the pain he'd caused Lisa. He'd heard through mutual friends that she was dating someone new, seemed happy, and that helped. But the weight of having hurt someone he'd cared about never fully went away. Still, when he weighed that against the joy of finally being himself, of waking up next to someone he desired with his whole being, of not having to perform or pretend or hide. There was no question it had been worth it. One Sunday morning, 6 months after the divorce was final, Derek woke to sunlight streaming through the windows and Brennan already awake beside him, watching him with that soft expression that never failed to make Derek's heart skip. "Morning," Derek murmured, stretching. "Morning, beautiful," Brennan replied, leaning in for a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened into something more. They made love slowly, taking their time, Derek's body opening to Brennan with an ease that came from practice and trust and genuine desire. And when they finished, lying tangled and satisfied, Derek felt a contentment he'd never experienced in 8 years of marriage. "This is what it's supposed to feel like," he said quietly. "I didn't know. All those years with Lisa, I thought sex was just okay. Thought I wasn't a very sexual person, but I was just with the wrong gender." Brennan kissed his forehead. "I'm glad you figured it out. Glad I got to be part of that discovery." They spent the day together doing nothing important. Brunch at a local cafe where they held hands across the table without worrying who saw. A walk through the park. Grocery shopping together like the domestic couple they were becoming. Every small moment felt precious to Derek. Felt like proof that he'd made the right choice. That evening, as they cooked dinner together in Brennan's kitchen, music playing and wine flowing, Derek had a moment of such perfect happiness that it brought tears to his eyes. Brennan noticed immediately, concern crossing his face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," Derek said, smiling through the tears. "Everything's right. For the first time in my entire life, everything is exactly right." Brennan pulled him close, and Derek melted into the embrace, feeling safe and loved and completely himself. This was what he'd been missing. Not just the physical pleasure, though that was incredible, but this deep sense of rightness, of fitting exactly where he was supposed to be. "I love you," Derek said, the words he'd been holding back for months finally spilling out. "I know it's soon. I know we agreed to take things slow, but I love you. You saved my life by moving next door." Brennan's eyes shone with emotion. "I love you too. Have for months. Was just waiting for you to be ready to hear it." They sealed the confession with a kiss that promised everything, that spoke of futures and forever, and finding home in another person. And when Brennan led Derek upstairs, Derek went willingly, eagerly, surrendering to the man who'd helped him discover his truth. Time passed, seasons changing. Derek settled into his new life, new identity, with increasing confidence. He joined an LGBTQ support group, made friends in the community, started speaking openly about his journey when asked. His family slowly came around, some faster than others, acceptance coming in grudging increments. And through it all, Brennan was his anchor, his safe place, his partner in building a life that honored who they both truly were. 2 years after that first afternoon, Derek stood in Brennan's bedroom. Their bedroom now, since Derek had officially moved in 6 months ago. They were getting ready for a commitment ceremony. Nothing legal since they'd both agreed marriage felt complicated after Derek's divorce, but a celebration of their love surrounded by the friends and family who supported them. Derek adjusted his tie in the mirror, seeing a man he barely recognized from 3 years ago. Confident, happy, comfortable in his own skin, in a way he'd never been before. The journey had been brutal, but it had been worth it. Brennan came up behind him, wrapping arms around Derek's waist and resting his chin on Derek's shoulder. "You ready for this?" Derek met his eyes in the mirror, seeing love and commitment, and the promise of a future they'd both chosen freely. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." The ceremony was small but perfect. Their chosen family gathering to witness them pledging their lives to each other. When it was over, and they were surrounded by congratulations and love, Derek looked around at the life he'd built from the ashes of the one he'd burned down, and felt nothing but gratitude. He'd taken all 12 inches that afternoon 3 years ago, and in doing so, he'd taken the first step toward taking all of himself, accepting all of who he was, claiming a life that actually fit, instead of one he had to shrink himself to occupy. The scared married man who'd knocked on Brennan's door, terrified of his own desires, was gone. In his place was someone authentic and whole, and finally free. And if sometimes late at night Derek thought about that first encounter, about the way Brennan had demanded he take everything and Derek had discovered he could, well, that seemed appropriate, because that afternoon hadn't just been about physical pleasure, though there'd been plenty of that. It had been about Derek finally taking ownership of his truth, accepting all of himself, even the parts that scared him, and choosing to live authentically no matter the cost. That was the real 12 inches he'd taken, the full measure of self-acceptance and honesty that had changed everything. And God, it had been worth it. Every painful moment, every difficult conversation, every relationship that had to end so he could finally begin. Derek had found himself by letting Brennan show him what he'd been missing. And in doing so, he'd found home, not in a house or a neighborhood, but in the freedom to be exactly who he was supposed to be all along. The end.